I appreciate you getting this done so quickly. These things have a way of working out, don't they? Everything recovered is on the drive inside the bag. Sometimes I think people underestimate how thoroughly the past can be cleaned up. Small operations especially, you just don't have the tools.
Victor Ashby left that shop believing the last loose end had been tied. He had chosen a small operation, deliberately, one man, no corporate oversight, no system that would flag anything unusual. The kind of place he had already decided did not have the tools to be a problem. He had covered every angle. He had verified every assumption. He had walked out the door certain that the quiet man behind the counter was exactly as irrelevant as he looked. What would it cost him to have misjudged one person if you believe that the most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody thinks to watch? Subscribe to the channel and stay with this one. Victor Ashby spent months making sure nothing could come back to him and handed it all to the one man he never bothered to think about. The shop had no sign worth reading from the street, just a hand-painted board above the door that said Garrett Tech Repair in letters Owen had touched up every 2 years since he opened the place. There was a small parking lot, 3 spaces, and a window display that hadn't changed since the previous winter. A disassembled motherboard mounted on foam board with a label that said, "This is what's inside your laptop." Most people walked past it without a second glance. That was fine. The people who stopped, who actually looked, tended to be the ones who understood what Owen did and why it mattered, and those were the customers worth having. He had been running the shop for 6 years, and the business was what it was, not large, not glamorous, but reliable in the way that good repair work always was. He fixed screens. He removed viruses. He replaced batteries and keyboards and fans that had finally given out after years of hard use. And several times a month, someone walked in carrying a device they described as dead, holding it the way people hold things they've already given up on. And Owen would take it from them and find out what was actually wrong. Most of the time, the problem was less catastrophic than the owner believed. Most of the time, things were fixable. It was the data recovery work that had given him the reputation he had, such as it was. Word traveled in a specific way in that particular niche. Dentist's office loses 3 years of patient records. Accountant's laptop dies 2 days before tax season. Restaurant owner's hard drive takes a power surge and takes everything with it. People talked. They sent others. Owen had saved enough of those situations that his name circulated in certain circles without him having to do much advertising, which was how he preferred it. His daughter Mia was 10, and she spent her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the shop after school, doing homework at the work table in the back, while Owen worked at the front. She had learned not to touch the machines without asking, and she had learned which parts were fragile, and she had developed over the years a working understanding of what her father actually did, which was more than most adults managed. She described it to her friends at school as fixing computers, which was accurate enough, and she described the data recovery work more precisely. Dad gets things back that people thought were gone. That description was correct, and it was the part of the work that Owen found most satisfying. Not the mechanics of it, though he liked those too. It was the underlying fact of it, the fact that what most people experienced as permanent loss was often something else entirely. A deleted file was not a destroyed file. A formatted drive was not a wiped drive. The distinction mattered enormously, and almost no one outside the field understood it, which was why Owen still had customers who arrived with devices that had been treated as hopeless and left with everything they thought they'd lost. Claire Dunning came in on a Tuesday morning, carrying a laptop in both hands, with the careful posture of someone who has been told the contents are important. She was precise about the problem power surge at the office the previous week. The device had not turned on since her employer needed the data recovered if possible, and needed a technical report documenting what had happened and what, if anything, could be salvaged. Owen took the machine from her and set it on the intake bench. He asked the standard questions, last known working state, any recent backups, anything particularly critical in the files, and wrote the answers on the service ticket. The device belonged to Victor Ashby, CFO of the Hartwell Community Foundation. Owen had seen the foundation's name on plaques in the library and in the acknowledgement sections of local event programs, the kind of civic presence that is everywhere once you start noticing it. Claire mentioned one more thing before she left, almost as an afterthought. Mr. Ashby needed the technical documentation specifically for the organization's board and for the insurance claim on the equipment. A written assessment from an independent repair professional confirming the nature of the failure and the extent of data loss. She left her number for follow-up and walked out. Owen put the service ticket in the intake folder and looked at the laptop. Then he looked at the ticket again, at the word specifically, and thought about it for a moment. Not suspiciously, just as a piece of information to file away. He had filled out technical assessment reports before for insurance and legal purposes. It was straightforward work. He turned the machine over, identified the model, and began his initial examination. The problem with the drive was apparent within the first hour. The power surge had caused damage to the read/write heads, the mechanical components responsible for accessing data on the spinning platters, and the drive was producing the clicking sound that technicians learned to recognize immediately. It was the worst sound a hard drive can make. Most people who heard it assumed it meant everything was gone. Owen knew better, which was why he did what he always did before doing anything else. The first step in any serious data recovery job was never to work directly on the damaged drive. Working on a compromised drive in its damaged state was how you destroyed the data you were trying to save. Every spin of the platters, every attempted read operation could grind the read/write heads across the surface and turn recoverable information into permanent loss. The correct approach was to create a forensic image first, a complete bit-for-bit copy of the entire physical drive, reading every sector in sequence and capturing whatever was there before touching any of it with recovery software. Owen had done this thousands of times. It was not a decision he made on a case-by-case basis. It was the way the work was done, the same way a surgeon confirms the instrument count before closing, the same way a contractor photographs the site before breaking ground. You documented the starting state. You preserved the original. You worked from the copy. He set up the imaging equipment, attached the damaged drive through a write-blocking interface so that nothing could be accidentally written back to it, and started the process. Forensic imaging on a drive this size would take several hours. He set it running, tagged the job in his system with the date and time, and went back to the other machines waiting on the bench. He ran the recovery software on the forensic image 2 days later, when the other jobs ahead of it were done. The results were better than he had expected. The platters themselves were in reasonable condition, and with the write-blocking protection in place, nothing had been overwritten. The software worked through the image systematically, identifying file structures, reconstructing the directory index, pulling back files from sectors that had been marked as deleted, but not yet touched by new data. There were a lot of files. That was normal for a work machine. Owen ran through the directory output and began the integrity verification process, opening samples from each major folder type to confirm that the recovered content was readable and complete, not corrupted fragments that looked like files but contained nothing usable. This was standard procedure. You did not hand a client a hard drive full of recovered data without verifying that the data was actually there. He opened the documents folder first, worked through a few presentations, confirmed they were intact. He checked the email archive, confirmed it was pulling correctly. He went to the finance folder, which was the largest in the directory, and started sampling. 2 files in the same subfolder had names that were nearly identical, the same naming convention, the same date stamp, a single character difference between them. That was unusual. People did not typically save 2 versions of the same document in the same location without a reason. And when Owen opened both to compare them, he understood immediately why they were different. They were the same quarterly financial report. The same period, the same organization, the same headers and formatting, and the numbers inside them were not the same. Not in small ways, not in the kind of variance you'd see from a draft and a final version. The variance was systematic and directional. One version showed fund disbursements flowing through the organization's standard accounts. The other version showed a portion of those disbursements routed to accounts that Owen did not recognize, and that were not labeled in any way that corresponded to the programs listed in the organization's public materials. Owen had no accounting background. He could not have testified in court about what exactly he was looking at. But he had been keeping the books for his own small business for 6 years, and he understood the basic principle of what a financial record was supposed to do, and what it meant when two versions of the same record told two different stories about where money went. He sat back in his chair and kept looking at the screen. He went to the email archive next, not looking for anything specific, just continuing the verification pass. The recovery had pulled back a substantial portion of the mailbox, including a folder the user had deleted, but not purged beyond the ordinary recycle bin empty, which meant the forensic image had captured it intact, along with everything else. There were several threads in that folder. Owen read enough of the first one to understand the shape of what he was reading. A back and forth between Ashby's work account and a personal email address he did not recognize, spanning several weeks. Discussions of quarterly reports. Discussions of making sure the audited version matched the board presentation version. And in the middle of one thread, a sentence that was not ambiguous at all. A sentence that described specifically the goal of ensuring that if the inconsistencies were ever examined, the paper trail would point toward the organization's head accountant. The name in that sentence was Frank Odom. Owen read it twice. Then he put the name into the search bar on his phone. The results came back in seconds. A local news article from 6 weeks earlier, front section, with a photograph of a man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in months. Foundation accountant faces corruption charges in Hartwell fund scandal. The case was in the middle of prosecution. The trial was still ongoing. He put the phone down on the workbench. Then he looked at the screen. Then he looked at the phone again. He stayed like that for a long time. The technical explanation for why any of this existed at all was straightforward, and it was the part of the situation that Owen understood better than anyone else in it. When Victor Ashby had deleted those files, and the metadata on the forensic image made it clear that he had deleted them, that the email folder and both versions of the financial report had been moved to the recycle bin, and the recycle bin had been emptied, and that a quick format command had been run on the drive shortly afterward, he had done what most people do when they want to ensure something is gone. He had done what felt thorough. He had done what he would describe, if asked, as wiping the drive. What he had not done was a secure erase. The difference between a quick format and a secure erase was invisible to the average user and catastrophic in its consequences. A quick format removed the directory index, the table of contents that told the operating system where each file lived on the drive. It did not touch the files themselves. The data sat exactly where it had always sat, unchanged, waiting. A secure erase overwrote each sector with randomized data multiple times, making the original content unrecoverable by any standard means. It was slower, it required specific software, and most people had never heard of it, because most people never needed to make something permanently gone. Victor Ashby had needed to make something permanently gone. He had used the wrong tool for the job, and he had not known he was using the wrong tool because the tool he used felt complete to him. And the power surge, the event he had used as the explanation for why the machine was being serviced at all, had done something he could not have anticipated. It had hit the drive mid-operation, damaging the read/write heads in a way that stopped everything in place. Any additional overwrite operations he might have initiated were never completed. The platters, the physical surface where the data actually lived, were intact. The forensic image had read them without difficulty. The drive had failed in exactly the way that preserved what he needed destroyed. Owen sat at his bench for a long time that evening after Mia had gone to bed. He had the forensic image on the recovery system and the folder of recovered files in a verified labeled directory. Everything he had been opened as part of standard verification procedure under the authorization that Claire Dunning had signed on the intake form when she brought the machine in for data recovery. He had not gone looking for anything. He had found what he found because that was what the work required him to do. The question of what to do with it was a different matter. He could complete the job as described. Prepare the technical report Ashby had requested, deliver the drive with the recovered files, and say nothing about what the verification process had turned up. That was one option. It was an option he considered for approximately the length of time it took him to think about Frank Odom's photograph in the newspaper, and Mia's voice from 3 years ago when her school had done a unit on civic institutions, and she had asked him over dinner what a community foundation was supposed to do. He picked up his phone and searched for the name Leonard Bass. It took him 2 minutes to find what he needed. Bass was the defense attorney on the Odom case. His contact number was on the law firm's website. Owen wrote it down on the notepad he kept beside the workbench, tore off the sheet and folded it once. Then he went to check that Mia's light was off, and the back door was locked, and he did the closing routine he did every night without variation, and he went to sleep. The forensic image was on the recovery drive. The intake form with Claire Dunning's signature was in the folder. The date the image had been created was logged in the system, with a timestamp that could not be altered without leaving a trace Owen had the expertise to identify. Everything that needed to exist already existed, made by a man doing his job correctly, before he had any reason to know that doing it correctly would matter to anyone beyond the client who had brought the machine in. Leonard Bass answered on the third ring, and Owen could tell from the way the man's voice shifted from the practiced neutrality of a professional, picking up an unknown number, to something more alert that whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't this. Owen introduced himself by name and profession, and said he had a procedural question about a data recovery case he was currently working. He said it carefully, giving Bass enough to understand the context, without saying anything that couldn't be said to a stranger on a phone. He asked whether a technician, who had found materials during a legitimately authorized recovery job, had any legal standing to disclose those materials to parties in an active proceeding, and what the proper channel for doing so would be. Bass asked him one question. What case? Owen said the name, Frank Odom. The silence on the other end was brief and carried a specific weight, the weight of a man who had been working with very little and had just heard something that sounded like it might be more. Bass asked if Owen was willing to meet in person. Owen said yes that afternoon if possible. They agreed on a time, and Bass gave him the address. The law office was smaller than Owen expected from a defense attorney, in a case that had made the local news 2 rooms above a dry cleaner, with a frosted glass door and a waiting area with 4 chairs and a dying plant that nobody had apparently noticed. Leonard Bass was somewhere in his late 50s, a compact man with reading glasses pushed up on his head and a yellow legal pad on his desk covered in handwriting that got smaller and more compressed, toward the bottom of each page the handwriting of someone who kept running out of room and kept writing anyway. Owen had brought a working copy of the forensic image on a separate labeled drive exported from the shop system, specifically for this meeting, while the original forensic image remained in the shop along with the intake form bearing Claire Dunning's signature and the date stamp from when she had dropped off the machine. He set both on the desk and explained what he had found and how he had found it in the same order the discovery had happened. Verification passed 2 files with nearly identical names, 2 versions of the same report, with different numbers, the deleted email folder, the specific thread with Odom's name in it. Bass listened without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who had learned that the moment you started asking questions, you stopped hearing things. When Owen finished, Bass picked up the intake form and read it. Then he set it down and looked at the drive. He asked the question Owen had been expecting: by what authority had Owen accessed the files on the machine? Owen explained the standard recovery workflow. The forensic image created before any recovery work began the verification pass that required opening sample files to confirm the integrity of the recovered data. The intake form authorizing access to the device and its contents for the purpose of data recovery. Claire Dunning had signed a document that gave Garrett Tech permission to access the machine and everything on it in order to perform the work she had requested. That authorization did not have a scope limitation. Data recovery required access to data. The 2 things were not separable. Bass wrote something on the legal pad. Then he asked whether any of the files had been altered, copied to any external system, or shared with any other party since the recovery. Owen said the original forensic image had not left the shop system and remained intact there. The drive in front of Bass was a working copy made from that image for this specific purpose, and both the original and the copy could be verified against each other using hash values at any point. Bass set his pen down. He said he needed to bring in someone who could examine the drive independently and confirm what Owen had described before any of it could go in front of a court. He asked if Owen had a problem with that. Owen said he did not. The independent examiner was a woman named Dr. Sandra Pruitt, who worked out of a university forensics lab 2 cities over, and who had, according to the brief introduction Bass provided, testified in federal court 14 times in the past 8 years. She arrived at the law office the following morning with a case of equipment that she assembled on the conference table with the efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a 2-room office above a dry cleaner. Owen walked her through the intake documentation and the imaging process while she worked. He explained the write-blocking setup, the imaging software, the timestamp on the forensic image file, the verification steps. She asked specific questions, and he answered them specifically without elaboration, the same way he answered questions about repairs with the information that was accurate and nothing extra. Dr. Pruitt examined the forensic image against the intake timestamp and confirmed that the image had been created before the recovery pass was run, which established that the image predated Owen's discovery of the files by 2 days. She examined the metadata on the financial reports, and the email folder confirmed the originating device matched the model and serial information on the intake form, and confirmed that the deletion signatures, the traces left in the directory structure when files had been removed, were consistent with a sequence of operations that included a standard delete, a recycle bin purge, and a quick format command executed in that order. The quick format, she noted for the record, was not a secure erase. The distinction was significant. She also noted something that Owen had identified, but not fully articulated, that the damage pattern in the drive's head assembly was consistent with a sudden power interruption during an active write operation. Whatever process had been running at the time of the surge had been stopped in the middle. The sectors that showed overwrite attempts were clustered in a specific region of the platter. The sectors containing the deleted files were in a different region, undisturbed. The power surge had ended the overwrite process before it reached the data it was apparently intended to destroy. Owen watched her write this down and thought about the specific quality of the bad luck involved in that. The bad luck of being stopped before you finished, stopped by exactly the event you were going to use as your cover story. 3 days after Dr. Pruitt's examination, Ashby called the shop. The call came in mid-morning, between a screen replacement and a backup job Owen was running for a dental practice. The voice on the other end was relaxed and courteous, the voice of a man who had no particular reason to be anything else when talking to the technician handling his equipment. Ashby said he was following up on the status of the recovery. He asked whether the work was on track and whether Owen expected to have the technical report ready by the end of the week. Owen said the recovery was proceeding and that he expected to have an update shortly. He said it in the same tone he used for all client updates, direct, brief, professional. Ashby thanked him and ended the call. Owen put the phone down and went back to the screen replacement. The call had lasted less than 2 minutes, and nothing about it had changed anything. The forensic image existed in the shop system. The working copy existed in Bass's hands. Dr. Pruitt's examination notes existed. The timeline was documented in a format that predated the call by days, and Owen had not said anything on the call that contradicted any of it. He finished the screen replacement, boxed the machine for pickup, and moved to the next job on the bench. The second contact came in a different form 4 days later. A man Owen had never seen walked into the shop at mid-afternoon when the place was quiet and said he was looking for a repair service for a laptop with a fan problem. The story was credible. Fan replacements were among the more common jobs Owen handled, but the man's eyes moved around the shop in a way that did not match someone who had just come in about a fan. He spent 30 seconds looking at the work table before he got to his question, and the question he eventually asked after the fan issue had been established was about the shop's data policy. Whether Owen kept copies of client data after the recovery was done, whether the drives stayed in the shop, or whether copies were made and stored somewhere else. Owen explained that client data was erased from the shop system after the completed recovery drive was handed back. Privacy reasons. standard practice for any reputable repair service. He said it the same way he said everything matter-of-factly, without affect, as if the question were as routine as the fan problem. The man said that made sense, said he'd bring the laptop in later in the week, and left. Owen did not watch him go. He turned back to the machine on his bench. He understood what the visit had been. He also understood that it hadn't changed anything, because the question it was trying to answer, whether a copy existed, had been answered with a partial truth. Client data was erased from the shop system after handback. The working copy Owen had made for Bass was not client data in the ordinary sense. It was a forensic preservation that had already been transferred to the possession of a defense attorney before Ashby had ever called the shop to follow up on the job. The man who had walked into the shop had been trying to close a door that was already days open. What Owen had not anticipated was the timing of Ashby's arrival to collect the machine. Ashby had called to arrange pickup on a Thursday and arrived Friday morning carrying himself with the ease of someone completing the last item on a checklist. He paid the invoice, made the remark about small operations and the things they lacked, took the laptop bag, and walked out. Owen had handed over the drive with the recovered files, the standard recovery deliverable, and provided the technical report Ashby had originally requested, confirming the nature of the drive failure and the extent of the successful recovery. The report was accurate. It described the damage to the read/write heads, the forensic imaging process, the verification methodology, and the recovered content. It did not mention the specific files Owen had opened during verification or the nature of what those files contained. That information had already traveled a different path through a different channel to a different destination. Ashby had wanted a piece of paper from an independent repair professional confirming certain things about the machine. He received that paper. What he did not know was that the paper he had been waiting for was the least significant document to have passed through Owen's shop in connection with his laptop. Leonard Bass filed the motion for a continuance and for the introduction of new evidence the following Monday, and the court granted the continuance 2 days after that, pending an evidentiary hearing on the materials Bass had submitted. The submission included Dr. Pruitt's examination report, the intake form from Garrett Tech Repair, with its timestamps, the forensic image, and its chain of custody documentation, and a preliminary analysis of the financial discrepancy between the two versions of the quarterly report. Owen was not present for the filing. He was at the shop working through a Tuesday morning that looked like any other: a virus removal, a battery replacement, a phone screen that had cracked across the lower half and needed to be assessed for whether it was worth fixing or not. He had been notified by Bass that the motion had been filed and that Owen would likely be needed for a formal statement at some point. He acknowledged the notification, made a note of it in his calendar, and went back to the phone screen. He had done what he could do with what he had found. The rest was in the hands of people whose job it was to handle the rest. There was one more thing Victor Ashby had not known, the one that mattered most of all, when the timeline was laid out in the evidentiary hearing, and everyone could see the full sequence clearly. The forensic image existed from day one. Not because Owen had suspected anything. Not because he had been looking for something to pin. Because that was how data recovery was done by anyone who did it correctly, and Owen had been doing it correctly for 6 years. The image had been created, time-stamped, and logged before Ashby had made his follow-up call, before the man with the fan problem had walked in, before Ashby had arrived with his comments about small operations and the things they lacked. Before any of it, all of it had already been captured, preserved, and transferred to a forensic examiner. Victor Ashby had walked into a shop carrying a device he believed contained nothing, and he had walked out carrying a device that still contained nothing, and both of those things were exactly as he intended. What he had not intended, and what he could not have anticipated, because he had not thought carefully enough about the person behind the counter, was that the nothing he believed in had been thoroughly examined and documented before he ever arrived to collect it. He had thought about the machine. He had not thought about the man. The evidentiary hearing was held on a Wednesday morning, in a courtroom that was smaller than Owen had imagined from reading the case coverage. He was there at Bass's request, available to answer questions about the intake process and the imaging workflow if the court required it. He sat in the gallery and watched the room fill, the prosecution on one side, Bass and his materials on the other, and in the middle a judge who had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having heard a great many things and having learned not to show what any of them cost him. The case against Frank Odom had been moving toward a verdict when the continuance was granted. That pause had given both sides time to review what Bass had submitted, and the prosecution had used that time to do what prosecutors do when new evidence arrives, without warning. They went back through their own materials, looking for where it fit, and what it changed, and whether their case looked the same from the other side of it, as it had from the side they had originally built it from. From their body language in that courtroom, it did not look the same. Dr. Sandra Pruitt presented the forensic findings in the sequence she had organized them, which was the sequence that told the most complete story about what had been on the drive and how it had gotten there, and what had been done to try to make it go away. She started with the metadata. The financial reports and the deleted email folder had originated on a device registered to Victor Ashby and had been created during a specific window of time months before the Odom prosecution was initiated, months before any external scrutiny had been applied to the Foundation's accounts. The timestamps were embedded in the file structure at the moment of creation and had not been altered. She explained what metadata was in terms that required no technical background to follow, and the judge listened with the focused attention of someone building a mental architecture from what he was hearing. Then she addressed the content. She did not interpret the financial discrepancies, that was not her field, and she said so clearly, but she established that two versions of the same quarterly report existed on the drive, that they were structurally identical in format and differed systematically in specific figures, and that the accounts receiving the diverted funds in the second version did not correspond to any entity listed in the Foundation's public filings. She had prepared a side-by-side comparison that she submitted as a visual exhibit. The judge looked at it for a long time before setting it down. The email thread came next. Bass had already introduced the specific content in his motion, and the thread had been reviewed by both sides before the hearing. Pruitt's role was to establish that the thread was authentic, that it had not been manufactured or introduced to the drive, after the fact, that the deletion signatures surrounding it were consistent with a deliberate act of removal, and that the timing of the removal placed it after the thread's last message and before the machine was brought in for service. She confirmed all of these things with the same measured precision she had brought to everything else. The deletion evidence was the final layer, and it was the one that carried the most weight about intent. A standard delete and recycle bin purge left specific traces in the directory structure. A quick format added different traces on top of those. The combination created a readable record of sequence, first one operation, then another, then the power surge that had stopped a third operation before it completed. She presented the pattern and described what it indicated, and she was careful to say what it indicated rather than what it proved, which was the kind of precision that made the substance of what she was saying more credible rather than less. Owen watched the prosecution side of the table while she spoke. The two attorneys there had the stillness of people who were listening carefully because they were no longer certain what they were going to hear. The cross-examination of Pruitt took most of the afternoon. The lead prosecutor was thorough and professional, and asked exactly the questions a thorough professional asks when the evidence in front of them is what they need to disprove rather than what they want to confirm. He questioned the chain of custody at each step, the authorization for access, the scope of the intake form, the possibility of contamination during the imaging process, and the interpretation of the deletion signatures. Pruitt answered each question in the same register she had used for the direct examination, specific, bounded, limited to what the evidence showed, and nothing beyond it. She did not claim more than she had established. She did not retreat from what she had established. When the prosecutor suggested that the intake form's authorization was insufficient to justify the access Owen had exercised, she directed him to the language of the form itself, which specified access to the device and its contents for the purpose of data recovery, and noted that verification of recovered content was a standard component of any professional recovery workflow, not a separate activity that required independent authorization. The prosecutor moved on. When Bass had Pruitt back for redirect, he asked one question. Was there any technical basis for concluding that the forensic image created on the first day of service had been altered, tampered with, or supplemented at any point between its creation and its submission to the court? Pruitt said no. She said the hash values, the unique digital fingerprints generated when the image was first made and verified against the image at every subsequent step of examination, were identical throughout the chain of custody. What was in the image at submission was what had been in the image when Owen made it, which was what had been on the drive when Claire Dunning dropped it off. Bass thanked her and sat down. The judge did not issue his ruling from the bench. He ordered a 1-week recess to consider the materials. Owen gave his own statement that same afternoon, a brief account of the intake process, and the imaging workflow, and the verification pass during which he had opened the files. It took less than 40 minutes, including cross-examination. He answered the questions as they were asked, without volunteering additional information, and he was excused and walked out of the courtroom at mid-morning and drove back to the shop where there were 3 machines waiting on the bench and a client pickup scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. He made the pickup on time and finished one of the bench jobs before closing. The day felt like a normal day from the outside, which was more or less how Owen had always preferred things to feel. The judge's ruling came 7 days later, and it was the shape of what Bass had been working toward since the first phone call. The evidentiary challenge was sustained. The forensic image and its contents were admitted as evidence. The court found that the chain of custody was sound, the authorization was valid, and Dr. Pruitt's testimony established the authenticity and integrity of the materials to the required standard. Based on the financial materials introduced, the court found sufficient basis to question the evidentiary foundation on which the existing charges against Frank Odom had been built, and it ordered prosecution suspended pending a full review. The review did not take long. The 2 versions of the quarterly report were sufficient by themselves to redirect the investigation. When forensic accountants were given access to the Foundation's full financial records under court order, they found the same systematic pattern across multiple periods, funds moving through accounts that were not in the organizational chart records that existed in 2 versions, with the discrepancies consistently pointing in the same direction, and a deletion history in the Foundation's systems that matched the pattern on Ashby's personal device. The email thread was corroborating evidence. The financial pattern was the case. What happened to each person afterward happened in the order these things happen, which is not the order a story would arrange them, but which has its own logic. Frank Odom was the first resolution, because once the prosecution suspended its case, the defense had what it needed. All charges were withdrawn. The Foundation issued a public statement, not a voluntary one, but one required by the terms of the civil action Odom's attorneys filed within 2 weeks of the ruling, that acknowledged the charges had been based on manufactured evidence, and that the organization expressed its regret for the harm done to his reputation and career. The statement had been drafted and reviewed by lawyers and sounded exactly like that, but it existed in the public record and said what it said. He received a civil settlement whose amount was sealed. He went back to work at a smaller firm than the one he had left in a different part of the state, doing the same work he had always done with the same attention to accuracy he had apparently always brought to it. His name cleared in the same news outlets that had announced his arrest, though the clearing received less prominent placement than the original story, as these things always do. Victor Ashby's situation was more complicated and more public because the complexity of what he had done and the duration over which he had done it meant that the case took time to build properly. He was arrested 6 weeks after the evidentiary hearing, which was approximately the time it took the federal investigators who had been brought in to map the full scope of the fund misappropriation. The 3 counts: financial fraud, obstruction of justice by manufacturing false evidence against a specific individual, and evidence destruction, covering the deletion attempt, were filed separately and adjudicated separately over the better part of a year. He was convicted on all 3. The sentencing hearing produced a result that reflected the court's particular view of the obstruction charge, which was not simply that Ashby had tried to cover his tracks, but that he had actively directed that tracks be laid, pointing toward a specific person who had nothing to do with what he had done. The judge noted that distinction at the sentencing hearing. Ashby's attorney argued that his client had made decisions under pressure that he now deeply regretted, and the judge acknowledged the argument and sentenced him accordingly, which was not the outcome the argument had been designed to produce. Claire Dunning's name appeared in the public reporting of the case in the early weeks before the full picture was established in a way that was less than fully accurate. She had, after all, been the person who brought the machine to the shop. Once the evidentiary record was clear that she had been given the machine to drop off, that she had no knowledge of its contents or of Ashby's intentions, that she had been performing an administrative task assigned to her by her employer. The reporting corrected itself, though correction always travels slower than the original story. Her attorney sent formal notices to the outlets that had named her most prominently. The notices were honored. She cooperated fully with the investigation and was formally designated a witness rather than a subject at every stage of the proceedings. Detective Roy Calder, who had handled the original investigation into the foundation's finances and had closed it without identifying the discrepancy that a forensic accountant subsequently identified within 8 days of receiving the same records, was the subject of an internal affairs review. The review did not find evidence of corruption, in the direct sense no payments, no demonstrable connection between the two men. What it found was a pattern of surface-level analysis in a case that had warranted deeper examination, a failure to follow the financial trail to the end, and a conclusion that had come too quickly given the materials available. Calder retired before the review was formally completed. The retirement did not remove his name from the report. The report was a public document and remained a public document, and it said what it said about the investigation he had conducted and the work that had not been done. People who searched his name found it. That was the particular kind of consequence that retirement could not prevent. The Hartwell Community Foundation's board of directors was not dissolved because nonprofit governance does not work that way, but the board as it existed at the time of the fraud was required to undergo a formal accountability review as a condition of the organization's continued operation. Half the sitting members did not stand for re-election after the review was complete. The foundation was placed under independent financial oversight for 3 years and was required to restructure its internal audit function from the ground up with external verification of the new protocols before the oversight period ended. Owen gave his formal statement, answered the questions at the evidentiary hearing, and returned to the shop. He was contacted twice more by investigators over the following months for follow-up clarifications about the imaging process, and both times he answered the questions the same way he had answered them at the hearing, specifically and completely. And both times the contact ended and he went back to work. The shop didn't change in any visible way as a result of what had happened. The sign above the door said what it had always said. The window display was still the disassembled motherboard on foam board. New machines came in, were repaired or not repaired, and went back to their owners. New data recovery jobs arrived with the same mix of urgency and resigned hopelessness that data recovery clients always brought with them, and Owen handled them the same way he always had, methodically and correctly, starting with the forensic image before anything else. He picked Mia up from school on a Friday afternoon, a few weeks after the last of the major sentencing hearings had concluded. She had been aware that something involving a case had been going on. She was 10 and observant, and had noticed the additional phone calls and the evening spent reviewing documents and the day he had gone to the courthouse. But she had not asked for specifics, which was a quality Owen had noticed in her since she was small. She waited until she had enough context to ask the right question. She asked it on the drive home, looking out the window at nothing in particular. "Can people delete the truth?" she said. Owen kept his eyes on the road. "Not really," he said. "They just think they can." Mia turned that over for a moment the way she turned things over slowly, without rushing to a conclusion. "Is that what happened with your case?" "Pretty much," Owen said. She nodded once the way she nodded when something confirmed something she had already half understood, and went back to looking out the window. They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet of two people who did not need to fill the space between them with words. Victor Ashby had a title, a reputation, a plan he had refined over months, and a fundamental assumption that the person he handed his machine to would not matter. He had checked the credentials. He had assessed the operation. He had walked in and walked out, certain that the gap between what he knew and what a small shop repairman could know was wide enough to be safe. It was not. And it was never going to be. That is the thing about looking down at people. It makes you stop seeing them accurately. You stop asking what they actually know, what they are actually capable of, what they might actually do with what lands in front of them. You replace the real person with the version of them that costs you nothing to dismiss, and you build your whole plan around that version, and you never notice the difference until the plan falls apart in a room where the real person is already on the record. This is what contempt actually costs. Not feelings, not relationships. It costs accuracy. And when your plan depends on the people around you being exactly as limited as you've decided they are, inaccuracy is not a small problem, it is the whole problem. The lesson isn't about computers or forensic images or the difference between a quick format and a secure erase. It's simpler than that. It's about what it means to see the people in front of you, to treat someone's skill and judgment and integrity as real things worth reckoning with, whether or not they carry a title that signals it. The people who build something that lasts in business, in leadership, in the ordinary life of raising a child and running a shop, are the ones who do not need to diminish someone else to feel secure. They stay curious about who people actually are. They stay honest about what they do not know. Do the work correctly. See the people around you. The rest has a way of following. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and follow along. There are more coming about ordinary people doing their jobs with care and the remarkable things that land in their hands when no one powerful thinks to look.